in the near future, and I think, this is the next year or so, nobody's going to care really what model you're using. MCP is an important concept to understand. Without proper context management, the risk is that the AI is going to hallucinate because it can't help itself but try to give you an answer. Hello, and welcome to the Health Tech Marketing Show. I'm your host, Adam Chirinas, and I want to thank you for joining us today. And also a big thank you to our sponsors, fine people at HIMSS and at Healthcare Now Radio. Really appreciate your support. By the way, if this is your first time listening, there are plenty of other episodes. You can find them on whatever your favorite podcast app is. Just subscribe to us on Apple or Spotify, whatever it is that you use. And we also have a channel on YouTube, and you can watch these episodes on YouTube and all the back catalog. There's over 100 episodes. And this is the first episode of 2026, and we have a ton planned. We're going to be doing these every week. Now, I'm going to talk about something today which has been bugging me for a while, and I suspect it may well be bugging you too. It's an AI thing. We've all been using ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini, and they are really impressive, right? And they can do some pretty cool things. But when it comes to using it for content for creation, for creating emails, for developing strategies, creating advertising that's unique to our industry, it's a bit limited, to be honest. It seems to do a pretty shallow job in the outputs that it creates, because frankly, the AI has a fairly superficial knowledge of our industry relative to what we need it to be able to, create really great output. It doesn't know your ICP, for example. It doesn't know your messaging framework. It also may be actually behind the times. It may be like a year behind in terms of where the legislation is. And I'm going to share a real specific example of that in a minute. If your salespeople are using it to create emails, they may be sending out stuff which is not compliant. And the problem is not that the AI is bad. The problem is context. And that's what I want to dig into today. I'm going to talk about something called MCP, and MCP stands for Model Context Protocol. Now, I know that sounds kind of super technical and kind of boring, but stick with me here, because this is actually the thing which makes the difference between AI being really useful and transformative in what you can do with it versus being kind of cool, but maybe a little disappointing. So I'm gonna break this down a bit, and I'm gonna share some stuff that we're learning through some things that we're creating, some technology that we're creating ourselves. We have a platform that we're developing called the HLP Brain, and we're learning a lot about the value of context by the work that we're doing on that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking on that, but I am going to spend a lot of time today talking about the importance of context. So one of the things that the sort of recurring issues that I hear, when I talk to people who are using AI, is they think AI is like hiring a smart consultant. You bring them in, you point them at your business, and they'll figure it out because they're smart, right? But that's not actually how this works. AI is more like, imagine you've hired the most brilliant person, but you've locked them in a room where they don't have access to your systems, to your data, to industry information. The information they may have about legislation may be a year out of date. And then no surprises when you ask it to provide whatever it is, a blog outline, an email, or a perspective about the industry. You ask it a question. What you're going to get back is going to be generic advice. And it's, it kind of feels like it comes from maybe a business school textbook at best, sort of, useful, structured, but still pretty superficial. It's not that the AI is dumb. It's just it can't see what you need it to see. And that's the context problem. It's not an intelligence problem. It's a problem of giving it the right information for it to crunch on. The more technical definition of MCP is it's a protocol that standardizes how AI models exchange context, tools, and actions with external systems. So think of it as kind of like interoperability is actually a term we all use in healthcare technology. And it's a standardized protocol that lets AI models discover, request, and use the external data reliably without custom integrations or prompt-based hacks, or just simply uploading documents. And this is what we've actually created with this thing that we call the HLP Brain. And to be honest, the technical details of this don't really matter. The importance of this is MCP is an important concept to understand from a strategic standpoint because it's all about context. And MCP is basically the rules of engagement for your AI. It's not the AI itself. It's not the data. It's this thing that sits in between and says, okay, AI, here's what you're allowed to look at. Here's what tools you can use. Here's what you cannot touch. And here's what you should be using to get a really good output. And so, in simple terms, sort of the really basic version of context is, when you have a prompt and you upload a few documents with it. And sort of, you're probably, in some cases, you're limited to uploading 10 documents and it's not a repeatable process. It's not scalable and it's kind of a pain in the neck. The idea with MCP is that it's an automated process, making the data, the rules, and the guidelines that you need it to crunch on easily available to it in a way that you control. Think about it like this. It's like when you give someone access to your Google Drive, you can set permissions, right? So you can say, I'm going to allow you to access this particular folder, but I'm not going to allow you to access these other ones. So this person can view and this person can edit and this person, but they can't see all these other folders at all. So MCP is a bit like that. And in the same way with Google Drive, you can put in gigabytes worth of data into Google Drive. You can basically do the same with the principles of MCP. And what MCP is essentially an access control system. And here's why this matters. And this is the key point. MCP doesn't make your AI smarter. It makes your AI useful because you're giving it more information to crunch on. And that's the huge difference. Without proper context management, the risk is that the AI is going to hallucinate because it can't help itself but try to give you an answer. And so what it's trying to do is saying, I don't really know the answer to this question, so I'm going to fill in the gaps with what I think it is and what I think is the right answer. And it can sound really confident, but be completely wrong. And that clearly creates a lot of risks for you in your business. I'll give you an example, actually. This was something which was a recent thing. One of our clients has created this really in-depth piece about the implications of OBBBA, the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, the impact that it has on things like data migration and healthcare data, and really well thought through piece. And they asked us to evaluate this against a tool that we've created for evaluating content. And one of the criteria is healthcare industry accuracy. And the thing that was interesting is it came back at a very low score. And we were sort of surprised. And when we sort of read the detailed analysis, it basically said this document suggests that the bill has gone through and the bill has been signed into law. And at this stage, the bill is still being negotiated. So what I realized was that because we were using ChatGPT's knowledge basically stops at at the end of 2024, unless you have the $200 a month subscription, which we weren't using for this purpose. So essentially, it was giving this very confident but utterly wrong answer based on limited knowledge. So with MCP, you actually would be able, because you would put in the sort of up-to-date data about the bill, and you could put in hundreds of documents about it. What you get back, and this is what we found when we updated our HLP Brain with the much more up-to-date information about the bill, the analysis of the white paper was much more accurate and much more helpful. Another example of this might be if you've got specific brand messaging or value propositions that you've spent a lot of time crafting, you want to make sure that whoever in your organization is using AI to do whatever they're doing with it, strategy, content, developing ad ideas or whatever it happens to be, is that they're using the most accurate version of the message. So you want them to be able to access the most up-to-date and accurate information. And that's where, you want that context to be available to them easily and, whenever they need it. But here's the reality of today. And this is something I think a lot of people are trying to get their head around is that most AI failures are not because the AI isn't smart enough. It's because they haven't figured out the solution to the context problem. And you can't just fix that by throwing ChatGPT 5 at whatever it is that you're trying to solve for. You can have the most advanced model in the world, but if it doesn't know your context, it's still going to give you generic and pretty useless answers. So what we think of, collectively as one super smart AI that can do everything is not actually what we really need to be able to scale our use of AI in a strategic way. What we need is for the AI that we're using to have better context so it produces better output. And so ideally, that context is intelligence-based. So the same underlying model can behave differently depending on what job it's doing and depending on what specific context it's accessing. So for example, when we're using the HLP Brain to build personas, it can access interview transcripts. It can interview really in-depth white papers related specifically to that persona. It can access technical or medical knowledge that you would expect that persona to have. And what we're finding by doing that is that the output is significantly more expert, and we feel a lot more confident in what we're getting out of the AI by providing sort of carefully curated and extremely detailed context. So if you're in leadership, you really need to pay attention to this because it's not just about productivity, it's about risk management. Because MCP determines what your AI is allowed to say to customers and what it's allowed to recommend, what data it can access, and what actions it can take. If you don't have this figured out, you're basically running blind, and your team is running blind in the way that they're using AI. The way I think about it is that every time someone in your organization uses AI, they're potentially exposing the company to risk. They could be sharing confidential information. They could be generating content that violates your brand guidelines or even regulations. And you won't know it's happening until something goes wrong. And this is why I keep saying, and I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, is if your AI strategy doesn't include really clear governance about context, you're not going to have a strategy which is going to succeed and scale, or a strategy that the rest of your organization is going to feel confident in. And so you may have a demo and a proof of concept, but you don't have something that you really can deploy at scale throughout the whole organization. I'll give you a concrete example. So imagine that you're working with a health system and that they're all excited about using AI for patient communications. But when you dig into it, you see that there's a lot of frustration because the AI was pretty generic about medical conditions, and it seemed to have sort of an inaccurate understanding of HIPAA, an inaccurate understanding of the different technologies involved in that. It may even sort of know things like high trust and, how data needs to be integrated. So what ends up happening is you get AI slop, or at worst, hallucinations. And so again, this is not an AI problem. This is a context problem. And until you solve this, the AI is limited in its use. And actually worse, again, it may be a liability. So where's all this heading? Here's what I think is really interesting. In the near future, and I think, this is the next year or so, nobody's going to care really what model you're using. There's been a lot of excitement about Gemini 3 and a lot of sort of like doubts about ChatGPT 5.1 or 5.2, wherever it is right now. But to be honest with you, none of that really matters that much. They're all really, really good. But what's going to matter is your context architecture, how you've structured your data, how you've defined your boundaries, how you've set up your governance. And that's where you're going to gain a competitive advantage, because you're going to be able to use AI much more productively and much more confidently. And this is especially true in healthcare, right? I mean, it's like we're in an industry where there is so much complexity, so many regulations, so many technical issues that, the generic stuff that's in the LLMs is just really not good enough. So let me leave you with a few key takeaways here. First, if you feel that AI is not as useful as you want it to be, it's probably not the AI's fault. It's probably a context problem. And the AI can't help you if it can't see what you need it to see. And just uploading a handful of documents is just not a scalable way to do it. Second, MCP isn't some technical thing you can leave to IT. This is a business strategy issue. You need to be thinking about what context your different use cases need and what your governance rules are and what your risk tolerance is, which in the industry we're in is pretty bloody low, right? Third is this is going to become one of the main differentiators in how you use AI. If you get this right, you can be using AI as a true competitive advantage. And what model you use is not really the issue. It's actually how you've set up your context architecture. That's much more important. And finally, in healthcare specifically, getting this right isn't optional. We're dealing with sensitive data. We're dealing with complex regulations, and the stakes are really high. You can't just throw AI at these problems and hope for the best. You need intentional context management. All right. That's my attempt at trying to explain MCP. Not the sexiest topic, but I do believe it's a really important thing. And I think that if you spend the time on this in 2026, you'll really start to get value out of AI. And I hope you found this useful. If you know somebody who you think might enjoy this, email it to them. They may well be grateful to you, and I'll be grateful because I might get another subscriber, which I always love. And also, if you like this show, if you found this useful, do me a favor, give it a positive rating on whatever podcast application you use, or give it a thumbs up on YouTube. And if you want to have a conversation about this, and sort of actually kind of understand a bit what we're doing with the HLP Brain, which is basically context on steroids, there's a link down below where you can book a meeting with me. So I'd love to talk with you. There's nothing for sale here. We can just have a nice chat. See you on the next episode.